Hello everybody, my name is Zach Merchant, and today I want to talk about violence in video games and how it correlates over to real life situations of violence, most especially with children. In other words, what I'm going to do is show that just because children are being exposed to violence in video games doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have an increased aggressive behavior in real life, or that they're going to try and go out and commit these acts of violence. So I'd ask anybody watching, do you play video games? Or do you allow your children to play video games? I know that when I was growing up, my parents allowed me to play video games, even violent ones, and even now as an adult, I still play video games. And I just don't believe I have any kind of increased aggressive behaviors, and most certainly don't believe that I can go out and commit these acts of violence in real life. Now, do you believe that your children have any kind of aggressive behaviors, or that you yourself do? Would you consider them homicidal? Most people wouldn't. And with 90% of kids in the US playing video games, or 90% of those games that they're playing are considered violent, it's most likely that most people don't believe that their kids are becoming aggressive homicidal maniacs just because of playing these video games. In fact, the government statistics show that youth violence is at its lowest even in the last 40 years, and yet video games have only become much more popular in that time period. If video games are becoming more popular and violence rates are actually going down among the youth over these last 40 years, then doesn't that mean there could be a more positive correlation? That children aren't necessarily finding a way to commit these acts of violence, since they might already know, or that they're having more of a way to get rid of these aggressive behaviors, these aggressive thoughts, by playing these video games. It allows them to have an outlet where they can potentially even relax or get rid of these aggressive behaviors in some way. Now, studies show that, with a lot of the laboratory studies, are showing that there is increased aggressive behaviors when these people are playing video games. Now, a lot of the time, these studies are just showing them quick acts of violence. So they're exposing these people to quick bursts of violent images, or if they're being studied through media, where there's no form of narrative, there's nothing that's connecting these pieces of violence that they're being exposed to. So if someone's just shown quick blurbs of violence, they're obviously going to be slightly more aggressive. However, if they're shown an actual narrative, shown that there's more to it, like with a video game, where video games are showing that there's character development, that there's not just a random string of acts of violence put together, then they're much less likely to have that increased aggressive behavior. Now, Christopher J. Ferguson, who is a professor and department chair of psychology at Stetson University, started looking into these studies. He was seeing that only the short term was being studied. In other words, when people were being exposed to those quick bursts of violence without any form of narrative connecting them together, and that they were being questioned afterward, that they were showing increased signs of aggression. Now, it could be simple things from a questionnaire, so the way you're answering the questions could show that you're slightly more aggressive or more likely to react in a certain way because of that. But they're being exposed to those quick acts of violence once again. There's nothing that's going to temper them. Also, because it's a questionnaire, it's all going to depend on what that person has been influenced in other ways. If a person was bullied their entire lives, or was possibly abused as a child, they might have more aggressive tendencies already, versus someone who was raised in a slightly different household or was exposed to different things in their life. It might be a little bit less aggressive in the first place. So it all depends on how a person is willing to answer, and the studies don't take into account the other things that the person might have been exposed to previously. So these increased aggressive behaviors, just simply in a questionnaire, doesn't really show anything. It's also very short term. Anything in the long term has no effect on the way the person is going to act. One of the ways that Christopher Ferguson was able to compare the modern issue of violence in video games is relating it to things that in previous years where jazz or rock music was considered violent, or was considered immoral even, and it was completely different from the times when it was first being exposed to people. And Christopher Ferguson is saying that that could be the same idea with violent video games in these days.